in my journey, it was very helpful for me to look at it very pragmatically, to kind of take my own emotions out of it so I could start healing. And what I broke it down to was my experience of traumas, or my addiction summed up as this. I experienced traumas throughout my life that went unresolved because I didn't have the tools at the time to make any sense of them as they happened. I found a substance that helped me to not think about them anymore. So I used that substance. Over time, my body became dependent on that. And it got to a point where that substance nearly killed me. I went to rehab to work on my physical dependency. And once I wasn't battling with my own body, then my true work of healing myself and my mental and emotional bodies really started. And so I'm currently in that process. I'm still doing it every day, something new. My girlfriend Allison, I'm sure, will tell you every day is some other new thing that he's thinking about. But so I'll break it down into two kind of separate talks. And the first is about my traumas, and the second is about what I've learned through my work in recovery. So my experience of traumas, and again, this is my own experience, so it might not resonate with everybody, and I appreciate that. I experience traumas as chronic and acute, much like you do to physical injuries. So the chronic ones are, for me anyway, there were things that happened over time. And they were small. They didn't seem as significant at the time, but when they were added up and I continued to push them down and I didn't acknowledge them, that became a bigger problem. And it became something that I started to feel every day. An example of that would be I was undiagnosed with ADHD. And I went through my entire life thinking ADHD was a made-up disease, a made-up now I say neurodivergence. I didn't know that word until like 3 years ago when I was diagnosed. But what that did for me, and an example of the chronic traumas that I experienced, is my brain didn't work the same. It wasn't broken. It just didn't work the same. And I didn't think of things the same. I didn't experience life the same as everybody around me. And when I was trying to fit into school, when I was trying to fit into communities, when I was trying to fit into a lot of different places, it didn't fit. And the solution to that often for people who are busy and kind of stressed out themselves is to punish or to correct. And these were things that I couldn't control. These were things like my memory. These were things like talking up in class and blurting things out. These were how I came to solutions of different problems that were either in the classroom or not. And being corrected on a consistent basis, what that taught me to believe as a child was that I was broken, was that my brain wasn't right, was that I frustrated the people around me, was that I created all this chaos, and it was my own fault, and it was something that I couldn't control. So that would be something like a chronic trauma that I experienced over time that led me to a belief where I wasn't good enough, that I was broken, that I didn't belong. And another thing, like when I started to open up traumas and I started to realize that trauma wasn't only reserved for the extreme cases, that they happen to all of us on a pretty regular basis, especially in this world. Things like 9/11, right? That was a trauma that I know it happened to all of us, but for me, it was very significant. And I know it affects everybody in different ways, but I started to walk around not feeling safe in the world. My parents divorced when I was 3, and that made me feel unsafe. My dad left the home, and I didn't feel like I was protected. I was unstable because I was going between households. My dad remarried, so I looked at that family as he chose that over me. And those are traumas that because I didn't have the tools to express them with somebody, that they started to build up in me. And I got to a point where I was feeling so much pain every day that the moment that I found alcohol, that was it. How could I not? How could I not look at this thing as something that I needed in my life? Because it made me actually not feel what I didn't want to feel anymore. And so I started to use it. I started to binge right away. And over time, I had my reason for using it was for those mental blocks, but really over time it started to become a physical dependency, as it does. As anybody who's experienced addictions knows, that it's not something that you can really control. And on top of that, constantly using those substances were traumas every time I used them. Every time I used them, I felt guilt, I felt shame, I felt this new thing to add on to the pile that I hadn't dealt with. So most of my life, I experienced those chronic traumas, but then it was later in life that I experienced more acute traumas There was a period of a few years, and this was really kind of like the end of the road of my demise of addictions to recovery. I experienced death on a myriad of levels. So one of my closest friends died by suicide. Shortly after that, the year actually to the day that we lost him, I held the lifeless body of a friend of mine who was hit in the head by a drunk sea-doer. And everybody that was there experienced what they believed she was dead in that moment. Luckily, miraculously, she survived. But that moment was still real for everybody there. And that was still us coping with death in that moment because we all believed it happened. 6 months after that, I was in the room with my grandmother when she took her last breath, a much more peaceful experience of death. And then 6 months after that, I tried to take my own life because everything just got too much and I didn't have any tools other than my addictions to help me. And those, I hated myself because of those. So I got to a point of, why am I here? I'm a burden on everybody. I may as well just end it all. So I did the isolation thing. I drove across Canada during COVID. I isolated myself completely and I was ready to do it again. But that's when I kind of woke up and I said, no, this is enough. Something miraculous, a higher power, whatever you want, whatever it means to you. It intervened and said, no, you gotta make a change. So I called my family, who I am so lucky that I have that support, because I recognize not everybody's got that support. And my love goes out to anybody who doesn't, because that's a hard journey. But I went to rehab and I worked on my physical dependency, but really what that highlighted to me is that the physical was only part of it. The physical was a part that I needed to clear up so that I could do the real emotional work and the emotional healing. And so I learned tools in rehab to start me on that. And I'm still on that journey. It's next month, it'll be a year and 9 months. So yeah, thank you. I'm pretty stoked about that. So 2 minutes. I wanted to leave most of the time to what I've learned from recovery, but life happens as it does. So the things that I learned throughout recovery is, number one, I hadn't felt emotions. I hadn't felt emotions for years, probably since the age I was 15 till the age I was 31 or 32. And anytime I felt an extreme emotion, I'd be pushing it away. I'd be pushing it down for the next time that I was sober, which was not a lot of the time. So now that I didn't have that tool that I had before to not feel those emotions, I was left with one option, and that was to identify the emotions and deal with them and let them express themselves completely and fully until they were out of energy and they couldn't be stored inside me anymore. So that was a big one for me. Another one, I want to make sure I get some of these. When I realized that that's what was happening, and that overwhelming feeling of those emotions was what was making me drink a lot more, I started to forgive myself. I started to look through my past and look through those traumas and realize that anytime that I was acting out, anytime I picked up a drink, anytime I picked up my drugs of choice, that was that hurt child coming through, looking for something, looking for a soother to not feel it anymore. So I started to forgive myself. And then when I started to look through my journey and realize that I wasn't a bad person, because that's where it had to start. It didn't start with loving myself. It was start to realize that I wasn't a bad person. Then I started to look at others and realize that everybody else has a story too. Everybody else has gone through something that I don't know anything about. And the thing with traumas is that I was holding on to them at the age that I experienced them because I hadn't dealt with them since they happened. So I was looking at a lot of these things as a child interprets them. And those child interpretation, they weren't enough. And the last thing, time's up now. Through that forgiveness, I built compassion for myself and compassion for others. And that built unconditional love. And unconditional love to me is compassion and understanding that everybody's got a story. And until you know what that is, withhold judgment. Don't do it. And my only job in this moment, and this is what I always tell myself when I'm feeling not my best, is that my only job in any given moment is to love myself completely right now. Because if I love myself completely right now as I am, then I have to love everything that has contributed to this version of me. And that includes the bad things. And if it isn't a lesson, it's a blessing. So thank you. That's my time. Appreciate you listening.